The eviction notice was a flimsy sheet of paper, but to Harriet, it felt heavier than a granite tombstone. Her hands trembled as she held it, the crinkling sound of violent punctuation in the deafening silence of Harriet's hearth. The fluorescent lights, usually so comforting, now cast a sickly yellow glow over the empty pastry display. It had once held rows of her flaky croissants and signature blueberry scones, each one a testament to sleepless nights and a heart poured into her work. Now it was just a cold, vacant glass box. A single defeated tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a clean trail through the faint dusting of flour on her skin. She wasn't one for tears. Harriet was fire and stubbornness, a woman who faced every obstacle with a biting remark and a plan. But there were no plans left. The bank, a faceless, monolithic entity, didn't care about her late nights, her strained muscles, or the small, loyal community she had built. They cared about numbers, and her numbers had finally hit 0. She walked to the worn counter, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves. Her grandmother, a woman whose spirit was as warm as a fresh-baked muffin, had taught her to bake right here. Harriet could still see her, apron tied tight, humming a lullaby as dough rose in the warmth of the back room. The scent of her grandmother's famous apple pie, a mix of cinnamon and love, was etched into the very soul of this place. A memory flashed behind her eyes. Her grandmother in her final days holding Harriet's hands, her gaze as fierce and loving as ever. A true baker, she'd said, her voice a fragile whisper, knows that even the sourest lemon can make the sweetest lemonade. You just have to be strong enough to squeeze it, my girl. Harriet had squeezed until her hands ached, but the lemons had turned to stones. The bank notice wasn't a sour lemon, it was a wrecking ball. The thought of this place being torn down, of her grandmother's legacy being reduced to rubble, sent a fresh wave of grief through her. It wasn't just a business. It was her home, her history, and her identity. She picked up a crumpled receipt, the last one from today. It was for a single cupcake. It felt like the universe was laughing at her, a bitter, final joke. She felt a surge of rage, a familiar friend. This couldn't be it. She wouldn't let it be. Not while she had a single breath left in her body. She had to fight to find a way. But where? The options had run out. She had begged, borrowed, and gone without, all to no avail. The well of hope had finally run dry. Just as she was about to crumple the eviction notice and throw it against the wall, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She stared at it, her thumb hovering over the decline button. What was the point? It was probably another telemarketer or a bill collector. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She wanted to be left alone with her failure. But then that voice in her head, the stubborn, unyielding one that sounded so much like her grandmother, whispered, "You just have to be strong enough to squeeze it." With a sigh of resignation she answered. "Hello," she said, her voice hoarse from the lump in her throat. A man's voice, deep and smooth, responded. It wasn't the voice of a debt collector. It was polished, confident, and strangely commanding. "Harriet Wilder? My name is Daniel Sterling. I believe you own a small business in the city?" Harriet's hearth? Harriet's blood ran cold. He knew her name. He knew her business. Fear and suspicion coiled in her stomach. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice regaining its usual steel. "I apologize for the late hour, Ms. Wilder," he said, his tone still perfectly calm. "I am calling because I have a business proposition for you. A very, very large investment." Harriet's laugh was a dry, humorless sound. "Sir, if this is a scam, I'm not in the mood. I'm about to lose everything." "I know," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "That's why I'm calling. I can save it. I can do more than save it. I can make your business everything you've ever dreamed of. All I need from you is a few months of your time and to be my fiancé." The words hung in the air, surreal and absurd. A single ray of moonlight sliced through a gap in the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. Harriet stared at the eviction notice, then at the empty space where her display once stood. The rage was replaced by a strange, tingling sensation. Hope. A flicker of it, a wild, dangerous, and utterly desperate flicker. I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's simple, Ms. Wilder," he said, and for the first time she heard a hint of something else in his voice, something like a challenge. "I'm offering you a deal you can't refuse." And in that moment, with the weight of her grandmother's legacy on her shoulders and her entire world crumbling, Harriet knew he was right. She had no choice. She took a deep breath and prepared to enter the most dangerous deal of her life. Chapter 1. The first thing Harriet noticed wasn't the sparkling chandeliers or the hushed murmur of the elite clientele. It was the scent, a sharp, sterile kind of cleanliness that made her feel instantly out of place, as if she were a wild, untamed thing that had stumbled into a cage of gold. Her best going-out jeans felt like a costume, and the faint smell of cinnamon and baked goods still clung to her old, worn-out denim jacket, a stark contrast to the perfume and cologne that filled the air. She stood there, a small, defiant anchor in a sea of opulence, a woman about to sell her soul for flour and sugar. The maitre d', a man who looked like he had been sculpted from solid judgment, looked her up and down. "Reservation for?" he asked, the tone implying she must have gotten lost. "Sterling," Harriet said, her chin lifting. "Daniel Sterling." A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed the man's face. He then led her through a labyrinth of polished wood and hushed conversations to a secluded booth in the back. Daniel Sterling was already there, a picture of effortless power. He was even more imposing in person than his voice had been on the phone, all sharp angles and quiet confidence. His dark suit looked expensive, but it was the way he wore it, like a second skin, that gave him an air of danger and grace. His eyes, a shade of deep, warm brown, met hers, and a strange, almost electric jolt ran through her. She bristled, her every instinct screaming to get away. This man was a predator, and she was very clearly his prey. "Harriet," he said, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice." "Well," she replied, sliding into the booth and pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders, "you said you could save my business. Desperate times and all that." Her eyes flickered to the untouched menu, with its Latin descriptions and prices that could pay her utility bill for a year. "This is a little fancier than my usual Tuesday night spot. I hope you don't mind if I stick with water." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I have a feeling you'll find our offer palatable." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Let's get straight to it. As I mentioned, I'm in need of a fiancé. A temporary one. A public-facing partner to help me secure a crucial land deal." Harriet crossed her arms over her chest. "And what does that have to do with me? I don't run in these circles. I bake bread for a living." "Exactly," he said, his smile widening slightly. "The council I need to impress is skeptical of my intentions. They see me as a ruthless businessman, and a lone one at that. They want to see someone who can ground me, someone with a genuine connection to the community. They need to believe I'm capable of more than just a power play. You, Ms. Wilder, are the embodiment of that. A fiercely independent small business owner with a heart." Harriet's laugh was a dry, humorless sound. "Right. A heart. That's why I'm about to lose everything." "That's where I come in," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "I'll invest a substantial sum of money into your bakery. Enough to clear your debts, buy the building outright, and provide you with a significant operating budget to expand as you see fit." He named a figure so large it made her dizzy. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, and it was enough to not only save her bakery but secure her future. She stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. It was an obscene amount. Felt like a sick joke. In exchange for what? "A few months of public appearances. We'll attend galas, community events, and dinner parties. We'll have to convince people we're madly in love. A little hand-holding, a little casual affection. That's it. That's it." Harriet scoffed. "You're talking about a fake engagement. A total sham. Do you have any idea how complicated that is?" "It's a simple business transaction, Ms. Wilder," he said, his tone turning cold and professional. The predator was back. "I give you money. You pretend to be my fiancé. The end. It will all be laid out in a contract. You'll be compensated handsomely for your time, and when the deal is closed, our arrangement is over. We go our separate ways. No harm, no foul." His cold, clinical approach should have repulsed her, but a desperate, pragmatic part of her found it strangely appealing. No emotional mess, no strings attached. Just a straightforward deal. The image of her grandmother's smile, her loving, flour-dusted hands, and the empty bakery came flooding back. This wasn't about her pride. It was about saving a legacy. It was about survival. "And what happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't even flinch. "Then nothing changes. The bank takes your building, you lose your business, and I find someone else. You're not the only option, Ms. Wilder. Just the most compelling." His arrogance was astounding, and for a fleeting moment she wanted to dump her glass of water on his expensive suit. But the need was too great. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the quiet warmth of her bakery, the familiar smells, the laughter. She opened them again, her gaze hard and resolute. "Fine," she said, the single word a surrender to desperation. "You have a deal. But I have some conditions." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. "Conditions?" "Yes," she said, leaning forward. "First, I want every detail in writing. A full-on legal contract. Everything. No surprises." "Done," he said without hesitation. "Second," she continued, "I get to keep my own life. I'll show up for the public stuff, but I'm not changing my whole existence. And I'm certainly not living in your penthouse or whatever giant mansion you have. I'm not playing Stepford wife." "We will need to be seen together frequently," he countered smoothly. "Living in my penthouse will make it more believable. You will have your own wing, of course. Complete privacy. It is necessary for the performance." Harriet's jaw tightened. She hated the idea of giving up her space, her small apartment with its worn books and her grandmother's old quilt. But she knew he was right. She gave him a short, begrudging nod. "Fine. But my bedroom gets a door lock." He actually smiled then, a flash of white teeth that was far too charming. "A lock will be installed immediately. Any other conditions?" "Just one more," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to call me Miss Wilder anymore. My name is Harriet. And don't you dare get too into your role. I'll handle the sarcasm and you can stick to being the brooding billionaire." Daniel's smile faded into a look of quiet amusement. "Deal, Harriet." He extended a hand, his fingers long and elegant. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. His grip was firm, warm, and far too steady. An electric current, far stronger than the one she'd felt earlier, shot up her arm. She snatched her hand back, her heart doing a frantic, traitorous dance. "So," she said, standing up abruptly. "When do we start?" "Now," he said, pulling out his phone. "My assistant will be here in a moment to take you to my penthouse. We can go over the contract details and get you settled in. Marcus is a bit reserved, but very efficient." Harriet watched as a tall, grim-faced man in a perfectly tailored suit strode toward their table. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over her, taking in her worn jeans and dusty jacket with undisguised disapproval. He gave her a slight nod that felt more like a judgment. She felt a surge of defiant amusement. "The brooding billionaire and the judgmental manservant," she muttered under her breath. "This is going to be so much fun." Daniel caught her words and a genuine laugh, deep and rich, escaped him. "Don't worry, Harriet. I have a feeling this will be entertaining for us both." As she followed the stern Marcus out of the restaurant and into the chilly night air, Harriet couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. She had sold her soul for a chance at a dream, and she had a sinking suspicion that the price wasn't just a few months of her time. The price, she feared, was a piece of her heart. Chapter 2. The ride to Daniel Sterling's penthouse was a silent, surreal journey through a city that no longer felt like her own. The tinted windows of the sleek, black SUV made the passing streets look like a muted, sepia-toned film. Outside, people hurried past, their faces a blur of everyday life. Inside, the air was still and cool, thick with the scent of new leather. Harriet sat in the plush back seat, feeling like a ghost. She was a woman who had just sold her soul for a bakery and was now being chauffeured to a billionaire's lair by a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus, Daniel's assistant, was a statue of grim efficiency in the front seat, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror as if checking to make sure she hadn't escaped. The silence was unnerving. He finally broke it. "So Marcus," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud. "What's your deal? Are you the silent, brooding type, or just not a fan of people who wear old jeans?" He didn't even flinch. "I am Daniel's executive assistant, Ms. Wilder. My job is to ensure his schedule runs with maximum efficiency. Your presence on it for the next 3 months will require adjustments." "Right. Adjustments," she said, nodding slowly. Because pretending to be a billionaire's fiancé is a standard line item on a to-do list. A snort of laughter escaped her. Listen, you can drop this wilder routine. Just call me Harriet. We're on a first-name basis now that I'm essentially your boss's emotional support human. Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Very well. Harriet. The way he said her name made it sound like a complicated accounting term. The car glided to a stop in front of a modern glass skyscraper that pierced the clouds. It was so tall that Harriet had to crane her neck to see the top. She felt a familiar unease, a wave of intimidation that had plagued her since she walked into that fancy restaurant. She was a small business owner from the suburbs, not a socialite destined for the penthouse suite. The elevator ride was a blur of polished steel and digital floor numbers climbing at an impossible speed. When the doors finally opened, she was met with a scene that felt ripped from a magazine. Daniel's penthouse was a monument to wealth and minimalism. The walls were stark white, the floors a gleaming dark wood. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city, a constellation of lights winking in the night. The furniture was sparse and geometric with clean lines and cold surfaces. There was no clutter, no personal photos, no books. Nothing that spoke of a life being lived, only one being observed. It was beautiful, but it felt like a museum exhibit. Daniel was waiting for her in the living room, a glass of something amber in his hand. He looked completely at home in this sterile environment. "Welcome, Harriet," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Marcus, I'll take it from here." Marcus gave them both a tight nod and disappeared down a hallway, leaving the two of them alone. Harriet hugged her jacket tighter. "This is a lot of white." Daniel chuckled. "I prefer clean lines. Less distraction. Come, let's go over the ground rules." He led her to a study, a slightly less sterile room dominated by a single massive wooden desk. A tablet was already open on it, a digital presentation ready to go. Harriet couldn't help but be impressed by his efficiency, even if it was a bit unnerving. "As I said at dinner, this is a business arrangement," he began, his voice taking on the professional tone she was starting to get used to. "For the next 3 months we are a couple. We need to be seen together frequently. My family is a high priority, so you'll need to be present at all family gatherings, dinners and events. I've compiled a brief dossier on them for you." He flicked the tablet screen and a list of names and faces appeared. "This is Olivia, my sister. She's an interior designer. Her sense of humor is a bit dry, but she's on your side. She'll find your candid nature refreshing." He gave her a pointed look. "This is my father, Arthur. He's the head of the family council. He's formal, reserved, and extremely discerning. You will need to be on your best behavior around him." "My best behavior is a subjective thing," Harriet muttered, earning a slight smirk from Daniel. He continued, the slides flowing seamlessly from one topic to the next. He covered everything from his favorite food, sushi, which was a lie according to Marcus's notes, to his favorite color, blue, also a lie. Harriet was starting to feel like an actress studying for a role she hadn't auditioned for. "Now for our backstory," Daniel said, a new slide appearing. "We met at a charity gala I hosted for a local food bank. You were volunteering with your bakery and we bonded over a shared passion for community outreach." Harriet held up a hand. "Hold on. That is a terrible generic story. Sounds like something a robot would come up with. And I am not a robot." Daniel paused, his expression unreadable. "Do you have a better idea?" "I do actually," she said, her mind already buzzing with ideas. "Our story is way more interesting. We met when a dog I was pet-sitting got loose at a local park. It ran straight to you, a big, imposing alpha type, and started licking your face. You, being completely flustered and out of your element, had to call out for help. I came running, furious and embarrassed, and we just started bickering about who was more responsible for the dog's emotional trauma. The dog's name was Stanley, by the way." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Stanley, the emotionally traumatized dog. I like it. It's ridiculous. And completely believable." He leaned back in his chair, a rare look of genuine amusement on his face. "Tell me, what are my hobbies according to our new story?" Harriet's eyes twinkled. "You're a terrible cook. An even worse gardener. But you are, in fact, a fantastic dog person who is secretly fostering a rescue dog named Bartholomew in your spare time." He laughed then, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the sterile room with a surprising amount of warmth. It was the first time she'd seen him truly let go, and for a fleeting moment he didn't look like a powerful billionaire, but just a man who found her funny. The tension that had been coiling in her all evening started to unwind. "I suppose you'll want a tour of your wing," he said, the amusement still lingering in his eyes. "I'll show you your quarters and then you can get settled in for the night. We have a family dinner tomorrow. My father has requested a formal introduction to my fiancé." He led her down a long, quiet hallway to a large, beautifully furnished suite. It was a self-contained apartment within the penthouse, with a spacious bedroom, a sitting area, and a private bathroom. It was so much bigger than her own apartment that she felt a lump form in her throat. This was the price of the bargain. A life of quiet dignity and independence for a few months of opulence and pretense. The last thing she saw before Daniel left her alone for the night was a small, almost imperceptible detail. A small, framed photo on a side table in the hall. It was a picture of a little boy no older than 5 with a wide, infectious grin. He was standing on a pier holding up a fish, his small face beaming with pride. For a moment she didn't see the powerful billionaire or the mysterious alpha, but a boy who had once known how to smile without reservation. The picture was the only personal touch she'd seen in the entire penthouse, and it was gone the moment she blinked. Harriet stood in the middle of her new luxurious prison, the quiet hum of the building and the distant city lights her only companions. She was alone, but she wasn't. She had sold her quiet life for a shot at a dream, and now she was about to step onto the biggest stage of her life, a fake diamond on her finger and a story about a dog named Stanley ready to go. She just hoped she wouldn't forget her lines. Chapter 3. The dress was a lie. A beautiful emerald green lie with a plunging neckline and a skirt that flowed around her legs like liquid starlight. It wasn't a dress for a woman who spent her days dusted in flour and her nights in worn-out pajamas. It was a dress for a socialite, a trophy wife, a woman who belonged on a stage like the one she was about to step onto. The woman in the mirror wasn't Harriet. She was a beautifully packaged imposter, and the thought made her stomach do a nervous flip. She felt a phantom ache in her feet, which were currently crammed into a pair of impossibly high heels. "This is not me," she muttered to her reflection, but the woman staring back seemed to be arguing the point. The car ride to the gala was another exercise in silent tension. Daniel, in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looked like a magazine cover come to life. He sat across from her, his expression a mask of quiet confidence. He glanced at her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "You clean up nicely, Harriet. I'm pretty sure this dress is doing all the work," she said dryly, adjusting the delicate strap. "And I feel like a human disco ball. You can't tell me this is a normal Tuesday night for you." "It's a gala for a children's hospital," he said. "They expect a certain level of sparkle." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "You look beautiful. Seriously." The sincerity in his voice threw her off balance. She wasn't used to compliments not like this. Her cheeks, to her immense annoyance, felt a traitorous warmth. "Don't get too into character," she warned, but her voice lacked its usual bite. When the car pulled up to the ornate building, a flurry of photographers with blinding flashes and reporters with eager questions swarmed the entrance. Daniel, ever the pro, was a vision of charm, his arm immediately finding its place at the small of her back. The touch was light but possessive, a silent announcement to the world. It sent a jolt through her, making her breath catch in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. This wasn't just a show for the council. It was a performance for the world, and she was terrified of forgetting her lines. They posed for a few pictures, Daniel's head bent low as he whispered something into her ear that made her genuinely smile. "Tell me a joke," she'd hissed, and he'd delivered a terrible one about a werewolf and a librarian. It was the only thing that kept her from looking like a terrified deer caught in headlights. Inside, the grand ballroom was a shimmering expanse of designer gowns and hushed conversations. Daniel seamlessly guided her through the crowd, a hand always on her back, a silent anchor. He introduced her to people with practiced ease, his voice warm, and his eyes, when he looked at her, were filled with an affectionate heat that felt a little too real. "This is my fiancée, Harriet," he said to an elderly gentleman, his voice laced with pride. "She's the owner of a wonderful bakery downtown. She's the heart of the community. Harriet, in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, tried to interject. It's just a bakery. But Daniel's hand gave a subtle warning squeeze. She fell silent, her sarcasm momentarily defeated by the sheer absurdity of the situation. This was more than just a business deal. This was a masterclass in deception. As they made their way to their table, a waiter with a tray of champagne flutes stepped out from behind a pillar. Harriet, caught off guard and still struggling in her heels, tripped. Time seemed to slow down. She flailed, her arms pinwheeling in the air, a mortified, "Oh no," about to escape her lips. Just as she was about to collide with the waiter and create a very public, very wet disaster, Daniel's hand shot out. He caught her, steadying her in an instant. Instead of a clumsy recovery, he smoothly turned her stumble into a graceful spin, his body moving with an innate, practiced ease. The crowd, instead of gasping in horror, let out a soft murmur of appreciation. It looked like a charming, spontaneous dance move, a loving moment between a devoted couple. He pulled her close, his eyes twinkling with a mix of triumph and amusement, and whispered, "Just go with it." Harriet, a mess of nervous energy, just stared at him. "You're a terrible person," she whispered back, and he laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that felt completely out of place in this cold, perfect room. The rest of the night was a blur of polite conversation and Daniel's flawless performance. He was the perfect fiancé, attentive and charming. He remembered to hold her hand under the table, to rest his arm around her chair, to pull her close and whisper something in her ear that was usually an observation about the terrible canapés. Harriet found herself falling into a rhythm with him, their fake affection feeling so natural that she had to remind herself it was all a lie. Finally, the gala began to wind down. In the relative quiet of the coat check line, Harriet's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. She looked at Daniel, who was talking smoothly to the attendant, his shoulders relaxed. "You're really good at this," she said, her voice quiet and laced with a hint of accusation. He turned, his expression suddenly serious. "I told you it's a performance." "No," she insisted, her gaze locking with his. "It's more than that. The way you look at me, the things you say, you're not just acting. You're becoming the part. It's a little unnerving." He took her coat, his movements deliberate. "My performance needs to be believable. It's what you're paying me for, isn't it?" "I'm paying you," she said, her voice rising in disbelief. "You're the one who needs the land deal, remember? The one who wants to be on the council or whatever it is." She lowered her voice, a sudden burst of anger surging through her. "You are just so comfortable with this. It's like you don't even care that we're lying to everyone." "We are not lying," he said, his tone low and dangerously calm. "We are simply reinterpreting the truth. And it's not that I don't care. It's that I have a job to do. I need this land. And you need the money for your bakery." He reached out, his hand gently resting on her arm, his touch a silent question. "Our motivations are aligned, Harriet. We're in this together." His words, meant to be calming, had the opposite effect. They reminded her that this was not a romance, but a transaction. She was a pawn in his game, and the thought that she might be feeling something real for him, something that went beyond the terms of their contract, was terrifying. She looked at him, at the perfect suit, at the mask of practiced charm, and she knew she had to leave. She pulled her arm from his grasp, the absence of his touch a cold shock to her skin. "Just call me when you need me for your next performance," she said, her voice brittle. "I'll be in my wing." She walked away, leaving him standing there, his hands still suspended in the air. The perfect performance had just revealed a very real, very messy truth. Their professional arrangement was quickly blurring into something far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Chapter 4. The dress, this time a simple but elegant black sheath, felt less like a costume and more like a uniform for battle. Harriet stood in front of the full-length mirror, her reflection a stranger in a world of high-gloss surfaces and silent luxury. She was about to meet Daniel Sterling's family, an event that felt even more terrifying than the charity gala. At least at the gala she was among strangers. Here she was an object of scrutiny, a performance for the people who mattered most to the man who was now her temporary life partner. The silence of her lavish wing was broken only by the nervous tapping of her fingernails against her phone. She felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy on her shoulders, a heavy, tangible pressure that reminded her why she was doing all of this in the first place. When Daniel arrived to escort her, he was no longer the brooding billionaire from the night before. He was a son, and she could see the strain around his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. "As I'll ever be," she said, managing a weak smile. "Just a reminder. I'm a small business owner, not a trained diplomat. I have no filter." A genuine, unpracticed smile touched his lips. "I wouldn't want you to." He took her hand, his touch surprisingly warm and steady. The Sterling family estate was a sprawling, modern mansion nestled in the hills. It was less sterile than Daniel's penthouse, filled with quiet, understated luxury. The aroma of a complex, savory meal filled the air. They were greeted at the door by a woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. She had the same dark hair as Daniel, but with a softer, more approachable look. This was his sister Olivia. "Harriet, it's so wonderful to finally meet you," Olivia said, pulling her into a warm hug. "Daniel hasn't stopped talking about you." She shot her brother a conspiratorial smirk. Harriet could feel Daniel's hand give a subtle warning squeeze. "He's usually so quiet about his relationships. It's a testament to how wonderful you must be." Harriet's face felt a little stiff from the effort of maintaining a pleasant expression. "He's a man of few words, that's for sure." As they moved toward the dining room, a tall, imposing man rose from his chair. This was Arthur, Daniel's father. He was a striking figure, a more weathered version of his son, with eyes that held the quiet authority of a man who had built an empire. He gave Harriet a long, assessing look, as if trying to see through her pleasant smile to the truth beneath. "Harriet," he said, his voice deep and formal. "It's a pleasure. Daniel tells me you've revitalized his life." "I think he's just using me as a way to get out of doing his own grocery shopping," Harriet quipped, a little too quickly. Arthur's expression remained impassive, but she saw a flicker of amusement in Daniel's eyes. Just as they were about to sit down, a new character swept into the room, a whirlwind of elegance and sharp angles. This was Serena. She was impossibly beautiful, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her icy blue eyes. She didn't look at Harriet at all as she glided past, but rather went straight to Daniel. "Darling," she purred, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "I heard you were back in town and that you were bringing a friend." Harriet felt Daniel tense beside her. He introduced them with a forced politeness. "Serena, this is Harriet. Harriet, this is Serena. We have a long history." Serena finally deigned to look at Harriet, her gaze sweeping from her head to her toes with a calculated dismissiveness. "Ah, the bakery owner. Daniel told me about you. It's so sweet that he's taking an interest in your humble business." Harriet felt her temper flare, but before she could retort, Olivia jumped in. "Harriet is a fantastic baker. She makes the most incredible croissants. Nothing humble about them." Serena's smile didn't waver. "Of course. It's just so different from the kind of people Daniel usually gravitates toward. Don't you think, Arthur?" she said, turning her icy gaze on his father. Arthur simply grunted in response. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dinner was a minefield. Serena made a number of thinly veiled attacks, all aimed at Harriet's background and social standing. "I hear you're the face of his new real estate project. I suppose it's a good way to get out of the kitchen for a while," she said with a saccharine smile. Harriet, who had been quietly fuming, finally had enough. "Well, at least I know my way around a kitchen. Unlike some people who probably don't know the difference between a spatula and a spoon. You could use some home-baked goodness, Serena. You seem a little salty." Olivia snorted into her water glass, and even Arthur gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Daniel's hand, which had found its way to her knee under the table, gave a gentle, appreciative squeeze. The rest of the dinner was a delicate dance. Harriet and Daniel fielded questions about their relationship, weaving their story about Stanley the dog and their shared love of bad sci-fi movies. Harriet noticed that Daniel, in a silent act of support, would subtly steer the conversation away from Serena's pointed questions. He'd catch her eye and give her a silent cue, a quick glance that told her to keep going. It was a teamwork she hadn't expected, and it was a small, strangely comforting thing in the midst of this overwhelming dinner. After dinner, Arthur asked to speak to Harriet alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she followed him into his study. He sat in a large leather chair, the glow of the fireplace making his face look softer, but his eyes were still sharp. "Harriet," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Serena has always had a way of getting under people's skin. You handled yourself well." "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I'm not used to that kind of passive aggression." "Daniel is a good man," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on her. "He has a lot of pressure on him. This land deal is more than just a transaction. It's the future of our family." Harriet nodded, her mind racing. Was this his way of telling her not to mess this up? He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I can see why he chose you. You have a fire in your eyes. A strength he needs. I just hope," he paused, his voice dropping, "that you don't break his heart." Harriet's blood ran cold. The words were a quiet, terrifying warning. He wasn't talking about the fake engagement. He was talking about something real. He was talking about a future that wasn't supposed to exist. He suddenly realized that he knew. He knew this was an arrangement and he was counting on it becoming more. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The stakes, she realized, were far higher than she had ever anticipated. Chapter 5. The sound of dripping water, at first a soft, rhythmic tap, quickly escalated into a violent, angry roar. It was a sound that had no business existing in the quiet, pristine air of a billionaire's penthouse. Harriet, curled up in bed and finally finding some measure of peace, sat bolt upright. The digital clock on her nightstand read 2:14 a.m. She had just finished replaying the terrifying conversation with Daniel's father, a conversation that had left her with a knot of dread in her stomach, and now this. A faint, earthy smell of dampness was beginning to creep under her door. She threw on a sweatshirt and a pair of old sweatpants, grabbed her phone's flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The scene that greeted her was pure, unadulterated chaos. Water was cascading from a fissure in the ceiling of the living room, a relentless sheet of liquid pouring over the minimalist white furniture and pooling on the polished dark wood floors. Daniel was already there, soaked to the bone, barking orders into his phone. His perfectly tailored suit was now a crumpled, dripping mess, and his usually composed expression was a mask of furious frustration. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a very handsome, very annoyed man who was currently losing a fight with his own apartment. "Marcus is calling an emergency plumber," he said into his phone, his voice strained. "Yes, now. I don't care if it's 3 a.m. And get a water remediation team here immediately." He hung up and ran a frustrated hand through his wet hair. "You know," Harriet said, a small, wry smile touching her lips, "I don't think shouting at the water is going to make it stop." Daniel turned, his eyes wide and surprised to see her. "This is ridiculous," he said, gesturing wildly at the cascade. "It's a brand new building. The pipes are supposed to be state-of-the-art." Harriet, ever the pragmatist, was already assessing the situation. "State-of-the-art or not, it's a burst pipe. We need to find the main shut-off valve before it floods the entire floor. Where's the utility closet?" He just stared at her, as if the concept of a utility closet was as foreign to him as a time machine. "I don't know. I've never needed to." Harriet shook her head and sighed, muttering, "Of course not," under her breath. "Okay, follow me." She started looking for any hidden panels or access points, a skill set she'd developed from years of working in her own aging bakery. She moved with a purpose, her feet splashing through the rapidly growing puddle. Daniel, after a moment of stunned silence, followed her, his expensive shoes squelching with every step. "Look for something small like a metal panel," she instructed, her flashlight beam sweeping across the wall. "Or maybe a panel on the floor." "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked, completely lost. "The source of the problem, Daniel. You can't just throw money at a waterfall and expect it to go away. You have to turn it off at the source," she said, her voice a little louder than she intended. She finally found it, a small, unassuming panel behind a massive abstract art installation. She yanked it open, revealing a tangle of pipes and valves. She found the main one and, with a grunt of effort, twisted it shut. The roar of the water slowly subsided, replaced by a grateful silence, punctuated only by the soft drips from the ceiling. They stood there side by side, soaked and out of breath, looking at the mess they had just contained. A moment of pure, unadulterated absurdity hit her, and she burst out laughing. It started as a small chuckle and built into a full-blown, body-shaking laugh. Daniel, after a beat of confusion, joined in, his own laughter deep and rich and utterly genuine. They stood there, soaked and disheveled, in the middle of a multi-million-dollar water feature, laughing until their sides ached. It was a moment of true, unforced connection, a shared ridiculousness that had no place in their fake relationship. After the plumbers and cleanup crew arrived and took charge, they sat on the kitchen floor, eating cold pizza that Harriet had ordered from a late-night diner. She had changed into a dry set of sweats, her hair piled in a messy bun. Daniel, now in a simple t-shirt and sweats, looked like a completely different person. The power and formality of the billionaire alpha was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded man. "I can't believe you knew where to find the shut-off valve," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Years of dealing with a faulty furnace and ancient plumbing at my bakery will do that to you," she said, taking a large bite of pizza. "You get to a point where you can't afford to wait for a plumber, so you learn to fix things yourself." He watched her, his expression unreadable. "You're so capable. So practical." "It's a requirement of the job," she said with a shrug. "What about you? What did you do when the lights went out? Just snap your fingers and expect a utility crew to magically appear." A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "I usually just read. Or watch old movies." "What kind of movies?" she asked, genuinely curious. "The terrible kind," he confessed, his voice quiet. "The ones with plots so bad they're good. You know, like old sci-fi films from the 80s where the aliens look like they're made of cardboard." Harriet was stunned. This was not the man she had imagined. She had seen him as a cold, calculating machine, but here he was, admitting to a love of cheesy B-movies. She looked at him, at the dark circles under his eyes, at the way he sat on the floor with his knees up to his chest, and she saw him for the first time as a person. Just a man. He met her gaze, his expression suddenly serious. "You're the only person who has ever seen this place look like this." He gestured vaguely at the damp floor. "It's always perfect. Controlled. But for the first time in a long time I feel like I can just be." Harriet felt her heart flutter. The silence that followed was different from their usual strained quiet. It was comfortable, intimate, filled with a nascent understanding. She was seeing the man behind the mask, and he was seeing her not as a business partner, but as a person who could fix a pipe and laugh in the middle of a disaster. The fake engagement had always been a performance, but in this quiet, pizza-fueled moment, the line between their roles and their true selves had completely disappeared, leaving them with nothing but the raw, messy truth. Chapter 6. The air in the penthouse was thick with a new, uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the polite, distant quiet of their first few days, but something heavier, filled with the unspoken memory of a burst pipe, a shared pizza, and a moment of genuine laughter. Harriet had seen the real Daniel, a man who watched old, terrible movies and was surprisingly helpless in a crisis. And he had seen her not as a business partner, but as a resourceful, messy woman who could fix his problems with a wrench and a dry wit. She was back in her wing, trying to prepare for the biggest performance of her life, the land council meeting. But all she could think about was the way his eyes had softened as he looked at her on the kitchen floor, the low rumble of his laughter, and the unexpected warmth of his hand when he'd first touched hers. The contract was still her anchor, the cold, hard proof that this was all a transaction. But her heart, a traitorous thing, was no longer listening to reason. When Daniel came to get her, the air crackled with a new kind of tension. He was in a sharp suit again, the mask of the billionaire alpha firmly in place. But his eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a mix of vulnerability and anticipation. He didn't say a word about the night before, and neither did she. The unspoken moment hung between them like a fragile promise. The car ride was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Harriet rehearsed her talking points, the ones Daniel had given her about the community garden and affordable housing, trying to sound passionate about something she knew nothing about. Daniel, sensing her anxiety, reached out and gently rested his hand over hers. "Just be you," he said, his voice quiet. "That's all they need to see. The real you." His words, simple as they were, had a profound effect. They weren't a direction for her performance, but a genuine plea. A small part of her felt a jolt of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't all a lie. The meeting was held in a stark, modern conference room with a massive mahogany table. The council members were all older, their faces etched with a mixture of skepticism and a deep sense of responsibility. They looked at Daniel with a professional distance, and at Harriet with a polite but probing curiosity. The lead councilman, an elderly gentleman with a serious expression, started with the direct questions. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice dry. "Your proposal for this land is ambitious. We've seen many like it. What assurance do we have that this isn't just a move for personal profit? That you genuinely care about the community you'll be developing?" Daniel launched into his well-rehearsed pitch about sustainable development and long-term investment. He sounded professional and his points were sound, but his words felt hollow to Harriet. She knew this was his business persona, not the man who laughed at bad movies. The councilman turned his gaze to Harriet. "And you, Miss Wilder? As an active member of this community, what are your thoughts on this proposal?" Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs. She was supposed to recite her lines, but Daniel's words, "just be you," echoed in her head. She took a deep breath. She didn't know anything about sustainable development, but she knew about community. She knew about people. "I can't speak for Daniel's business plan," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But I can tell you what I see. This isn't just about land. It's about a place where people can feel like they belong. It's about a neighborhood with local shops, where you know your baker's name and she knows yours. It's about a place with a soul, not just a bunch of fancy apartments. The community garden isn't just a line item on a budget. It's a place where children can learn where their food comes from, where neighbors can talk to each other, and where people can put down roots." She looked at Daniel and a strange, quiet moment passed between them. She wasn't acting anymore. She was speaking from her heart, from a place of deep, unshakable belief. She saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, a look of awe and something that felt a lot like pride. The council members exchanged glances. Their skepticism hadn't vanished, but it had softened. They saw her sincerity, her passion, and the very real connection she had to the idea of community. They saw her, a woman who wasn't just a rich man's fiancée, but a force of nature in her own right. The meeting continued for another hour, but the tone had shifted. The council started to ask more specific questions, not just about the numbers but about the heart of the project. They talked about the possibility of a local market, about a public park, about preserving the unique character of the neighborhood. Harriet and Daniel answered as a team, Harriet adding the personal, heartfelt details, and Daniel providing the logistical and financial framework. It was a perfect, symbiotic rhythm. When the meeting finally ended, the lead councilman rose and shook Daniel's hand, a genuine smile on his face. "Mr. Sterling, you've made a very compelling case. It seems you have found a partner who is not only a capable asset but a valuable moral compass." He then turned to Harriet. "We look forward to working with you both." As they left the building and stepped out into the cool evening air, a wave of relief washed over them. The performance was over and they had succeeded. The land deal was all but secured. Harriet turned to Daniel, her face alight with a smile. "We did it. We actually did it." Daniel, his expression unreadable, simply stared at her. "You were incredible," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You spoke with such passion. It was captivating." "I was just telling the truth," she said, her smile fading as she looked at him. "I meant what I said about the community. I genuinely believe in it." He didn't respond with a joke or a business remark. He just kept looking at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. The space between them felt impossibly small. The contract, the lies, the pretense of their relationship, it all fell away. This was just them, two people who had found something real in a fake world. And then, without a word, he closed the distance between them. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks, and he kissed her. It was not the public kiss from the gala, which was a practiced performance. This kiss was real. It was fierce and possessive and filled with a desperate, pent-up emotion. It was a kiss that had been a long time coming, a moment that shattered the last remaining wall between them. When he pulled away, they were both breathless, their faces inches apart. Harriet's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. This wasn't in the contract. This wasn't part of the deal. She looked into his eyes and saw her own confusion reflected back, but also something else. A silent, terrifying promise that this was only the beginning. Chapter 7. The kiss wasn't just a kiss. It was a complete demolition of the carefully constructed wall they had built between their professional arrangement and their personal lives. The moment they pulled apart in the cool evening air, all the rules, all the polite distances, all the clear lines of their contract were gone. They drove back to the penthouse in a silence that was far more electric than the one on their ride over. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions and a new, bewildering awareness of each other. The air was thick with the scent of his cologne and the memory of his lips on hers, and it felt impossibly intimate. Harriet's mind was a whirlwind. This wasn't in the deal. The agreement was clear. A fake engagement, public appearances, no harm, no foul. A kiss that felt that real was definitely foul. She snuck a glance at Daniel, whose face was unreadable as he stared out the window. She wondered if he regretted it, if it was just a moment of impulsive celebration. But a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. What if it wasn't? What if it meant something? The next morning the awkwardness was palpable. They met in the kitchen, a space that had become their unexpected sanctuary. Daniel was making coffee, and the simple act felt charged with a new significance. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Morning," she replied, her voice a little too bright. Neither of them mentioned the kiss. It was the giant, invisible elephant in the room, lumbering around and making them both feel clumsy and off balance. They went back to their routine, but it was all subtly different. When he handed her a cup of coffee, his fingers brushed against hers and he didn't pull away immediately. When she talked about her bakery, he listened not with polite interest, but with a quiet, focused intensity that made her feel truly seen. Their date nights started to shift. Instead of going to fancy restaurants to be seen, Daniel would suggest going somewhere normal. One night she dragged him to her favorite local diner, a place with red vinyl booths and chipped coffee mugs. She watched, endlessly amused, as the billionaire alpha tried to figure out how to order from the laminated menu. He looked completely out of his element, but he was game. He even tried the chili fries, a skeptical look on his face, before admitting with a surprised grunt that they were not terrible. She saw him then not as the ruthless businessman, but as a man who was quietly, unexpectedly enjoying her world. He in turn would drag her to private screenings of terrible movies he loved. She found herself genuinely laughing as he would lean over and whisper a critique of the cardboard cutout alien costumes. In the dark of the private screening room, with the scent of popcorn in the air, their hands would often brush, and in a simple, non-performative gesture he would intertwine his fingers with hers, holding on. The contract was a distant memory. This was a quiet, comfortable reality. The problem was that their genuine connection was starting to bleed into their public performances. The forced proximity was no longer a chore. It was a quiet joy. The playful banter that had been a part of their act now felt like genuine foreplay. He would catch her eye across a crowded room and a small, private smile would pass between them. She found herself looking for him, for his quiet support, for the reassuring presence of his hand at the small of her back. The professional arrangement had been simple. This new, messy reality was terrifying. The stakes reached a fever pitch at a mandatory meet and greet for local community leaders. It was a low-key affair held in a stuffy hotel ballroom, but the purpose was the same: to show off his loving fiancée. Daniel was mingling with a group of people when a particularly pushy reporter with a digital recorder thrust it in front of Harriet's face. "Ms. Wilder, we've all heard the stories about your courtship with Mr. Sterling," the reporter said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Some might say it's all a little too perfect. A whirlwind romance between a billionaire and a baker. Is it all just a business transaction?" Harriet's blood ran cold. The reporter's words were a direct hit. She opened her mouth to give a generic, polite answer, but before she could, Daniel was at her side, his arm slipping around her waist in a familiar, possessive gesture. "My relationship with Harriet is no one's business but our own," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a subtle warning that sent a shiver down her spine. "But I will tell you this. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I wouldn't trade our time together for all the money in the world." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a searing intensity that felt so honest it took her breath away. Then, in a moment of pure, unscripted idiocy, she accidentally said the one word that would forever be a testament to their ridiculous, genuine life together. "Oh, thank you, honey bunny," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The reporter's eyes widened. A few people nearby stifled a laugh. Daniel's face went from a mask of fierce protectiveness to a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at her, then back at the reporter, then back at her again, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. She has a lot of little nicknames for me," he said, the words barely containing his laughter. She says it's because I'm just so sweet. Harriet, mortified, wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The reporter, sensing that the joke was on her, gave up and moved away. Daniel led her away from the crowd, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. He pulled her into a quiet corner, his eyes brimming with mirth. "Honey bunny," he whispered, a huge boyish smile on his face. "I don't know why I said that," she hissed, trying to keep a straight face. "It just came out. It's a completely ridiculous, mortifying name." "I think it's fantastic," he said, his voice still shaking with laughter. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "It's a testament to how real we've gotten. We're a mess, Harriet. A beautiful, ridiculous mess." She looked up at him and her heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. He wasn't joking anymore. The laughter faded, replaced by a deep, tender sincerity. This wasn't an act. This wasn't a performance. They were two people standing in a crowded ballroom in a contract they had both agreed to, and she was falling in love with him. He was a billionaire alpha and she was a small-town baker, and the line between their lives had finally blurred beyond recognition. And for the first time she was terrified of what would happen when the contract finally ran out. Chapter 8. The ticking of the clock was a relentless, agonizing rhythm. With each passing day the land deal drew closer, and with it the final terrifying moment when the contract would expire. The humor had faded, replaced by a low-grade anxiety that hummed beneath the surface of every conversation. The Honey Bunny incident was no longer a funny story. It was a testament to how far they had fallen, how completely the line had blurred. Harriet and Daniel had stopped pretending. They spent their evenings in quiet companionship, sharing meals, watching terrible movies, and talking about everything and nothing. The pretense was gone, but so was the safety net of their simple arrangement. Now the stakes were personal. She was falling for him, and the thought of losing her heart in a deal that was never meant to be anything more than a business transaction was more terrifying than any eviction notice. The day of the final council meeting arrived, a beautiful, crisp morning that felt completely at odds with the turmoil inside her. Daniel was tense, his usual composure replaced by a subtle, restless energy. He was focused on the deal, on the business, on the win. But when he looked at her, his eyes held a plea she had never seen before, a silent question of what came next. The meeting was held in a formal chamber, the air thick with the smell of old paper and nervous ambition. The council members were all there, and so were the key stakeholders. Among them, polished and smiling, was Serena. She gave Harriet a look that was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Harriet's stomach tightened. She knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that Serena was not here to congratulate them. The meeting proceeded smoothly at first. Daniel gave a compelling presentation, outlining the final plans for the development. His voice was calm, confident, and professional. The council members were clearly impressed. The land deal was all but done. Just as the lead councilman was about to officially announce his approval, Serena stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a sharp, clear cut through the celebratory murmurs. "I have a question for Mr. Sterling." Daniel's face was a mask of polite inquiry, but Harriet saw his jaw clench. He knew this wasn't a casual question. "I'm sure you're all impressed by this perfect couple," Serena began, her smile not reaching her eyes. "A beautiful romance blossoming at the perfect time to secure a crucial business deal. It's all very cinematic. But I've heard rumors. Whispers." She turned her gaze to Harriet, her eyes holding a cruel triumph. "Whispers that this is not a romance at all, but a very expensive contract." A collective gasp went through the room. The council members looked from Serena to Daniel and Harriet, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion. The quiet hum of the room dissolved into a deafening, pregnant silence. "Serena, that's enough," Daniel said, his voice dangerously low. The alpha in him was on full display now, all sharp edges and raw authority. "Is it, Daniel?" she said, ignoring him. She pulled a printed document from her briefcase. "I have a copy of the contract. The one that was drawn up between you and Ms. Wilder. It outlines her services as your fake fiancé, for a very tidy sum of money, and it clearly states a termination date that just happens to coincide with the end of this land deal. It also includes an extensive non-disclosure agreement. Why would a real fiancé need to sign a contract, Daniel?" The room erupted into shocked whispers. Harriet's blood ran cold. She knew the document existed, but she never imagined Serena would have a copy. She looked at Daniel, her heart hammering in her chest. His face was a thundercloud of fury. This was it. The moment they had feared. The lie was out, and it threatened to destroy not just the deal, but the fragile, terrifyingly real love they had found. The lead councilman cleared his throat, his expression grim. "Mr. Sterling, is this true?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at Harriet, his eyes filled with a conflict so raw it broke her heart. He could deny it, call it a forgery, but he knew the truth would come out. He was a man of integrity, even if this situation was built on a lie. He had to make a choice: protect his reputation or protect her. Harriet felt a surge of strength, a fiery defiance that had been missing for weeks. She wasn't going to let Serena destroy everything. She stepped forward, her chin held high. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's true. We had a contract." A ripple of shock went through the room. Daniel looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and silent gratitude. "But what Serena doesn't understand," Harriet continued, her gaze fixed on the councilman, "is that a contract is just a piece of paper. It can't dictate what happens in a person's heart." She looked back at Daniel, her voice softening, all the pretense stripped away. "When we started, it was a business deal. I was losing my bakery, my grandmother's legacy, and he offered me a chance to save it. He needed a partner for a few months, and I needed a lifeline. It was simple. But somewhere along the way it stopped being about the business. We weren't just pretending anymore." She turned to face the council, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, but her eyes held a fierce, unshakable honesty. "I fell in love with a man who watches cheesy sci-fi movies, and who knows how to fix a leaky pipe. I fell in love with a man who values community and who wants to do something good, not just profitable. And he fell in love with me. We didn't choose this. It just happened. And a contract can't take away what's real." The room was silent. The council members looked from Harriet, a woman whose passion and honesty were on raw display, to Daniel, a man who, for the first time, seemed more human than billionaire. Daniel stepped forward, his hand finding hers and lacing their fingers together, a possessive, silent claim. "Harriet is right," he said, his voice a low rumble filled with emotion. "When I met her, I was just looking for a solution to a problem. I was looking for a partner for a deal. I didn't know I would find my mate. This land deal is important to me, but she is more important. The contract may be in writing, but the feelings, they're real. And I will not apologize for that." The lead councilman looked at the document in his hand, then at the two of them, their hands intertwined, their faces an open book of fear and love. He sighed, a slow, weary sound. "I believe you, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice quiet. "And I believe you, Ms. Wilder." He placed the document on the table and looked at his fellow council members. "The deal is approved." Harriet felt a wave of dizzying relief. The deal was done. But the most important part of the conversation was only just beginning. She looked at Daniel, and a new question, more terrifying and more wonderful than any business deal, hung in the air between them. Where did they go from here? The contract was over. The business was done. But their love, messy and complicated as it was, had just begun. Epilogue. The silence that followed the meeting was not one of shock or tension, but of pure, unadulterated relief. The contract was over. The business was done. They stood there, hands intertwined in the middle of a room of powerful strangers, and for the first time, they were simply Harriet and Daniel. All the pretense, all the lies, all the careful performances had finally come to an end. Daniel led her out of the chamber, past the stunned faces of the council members and Serena's defeated glare, and into the cool evening air. The city skyline, so distant and cold on that first night, now felt like their own. They drove back to the penthouse in a silence that was different from any they had ever shared. It was a comfortable, quiet space where words were no longer needed. They had laid bare their hearts in front of a room full of people, and now there was nothing left to hide. When they got to the penthouse, they didn't go to their separate wings. They stood in the living room, in the place where the pipe had burst, where a torrent of water had washed away their lies and a shared pizza had opened the door to their souls. "Harriet," Daniel said, his voice low and a little shaky, "I know the contract is over. I know this was only supposed to be for a few months. But I don't want it to end. I don't want to go back to a life without you. The land deal, it's nothing compared to this. To us." Harriet's heart swelled with a mixture of love and an almost unbearable sense of rightness. "Me neither," she said, her voice a whisper. She took a step closer to him, her fingers lacing around his neck. "I was terrified of losing my bakery. But I was even more terrified of losing you. I fell in love with a man who lets me win at poker, who laughs at my terrible jokes, and who is more of a hero than any alpha I've ever read about." He pulled her into his arms, a sigh of pure relief escaping his lips. "You're not losing me, Harriet. Ever." The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, private happiness. Daniel took her back to her bakery, Harriet's hearth, and presented her with a set of blueprints. The building was already hers, bought outright with his investment, but these were for a new plan. A much larger, better-equipped bakery with a community garden in the back. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a tangible reminder that their crazy business deal had led to a beautiful, real future. Serena's desperate attempt to expose them had backfired spectacularly. The council, impressed by their honesty and the genuine emotion they displayed, had not only approved the deal but had made Daniel a permanent member, citing his clear commitment to the community. Serena, now exposed as a jealous, malicious ex, had been quietly ostracized from their inner circle. Her defeat was silent but complete. Their relationship was no longer a performance for the public. It was a real, messy, wonderfully awkward relationship between two very different people. They moved in together but not in the sterile, unlived-in way of the contract. Harriet brought her worn-out books, her grandmother's old quilt, and her collection of mismatched coffee mugs. Daniel, in turn, bought a new, comfier couch for their movie nights and actually started learning how to garden, laughing at his own lack of a green thumb. There were still awkward moments, of course. Harriet still called him Honey Bunny at the most inconvenient times, and Daniel still had to be reminded that you couldn't throw money at every problem. Their lives, once so far apart, were now a beautiful, funny tapestry of shared moments. They were a mix of his polished world and her grounded one, a blend of fancy dinners and late-night chili fries. The story concludes 6 months later on a chilly Saturday morning. The bakery, Harriet's hearth, was now a thriving hub of the community. It had a new sign, a new warm interior, and a constant stream of customers. The community garden was already in its second season, a verdant space where neighbors laughed and shared recipes. Harriet stood in the back, kneading dough with flour on her hands, her heart full. Daniel walked in, a large coffee in his hand and a small, mischievous grin on his face. He was in a pair of old jeans and a worn-out flannel shirt, a far cry from the impeccable suits she was used to. He leaned over the counter and kissed her, his lips tasting faintly of coffee. "Happy anniversary, Honey Bunny," he whispered, and for a moment her heart stopped. "It's not our anniversary," she said, a playful frown on her face. "It's just Saturday." "No," he said, his gaze serious. 6 months ago today we made a bargain. We signed a contract. And we both got something we never thought we'd find." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring. It wasn't the fake diamond from their public appearances, but a simple, elegant one with a stone that sparkled with a quiet fire. He didn't get down on one knee. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that was real and true and completely hers. "The contract is over," he said, his voice a low, tender promise. "But I want to make a new deal. One that lasts forever. Will you be my real fiancée, Harriet?" Harriet's heart, a fragile, broken thing she had guarded for so long, finally surrendered completely. It wasn't a business transaction or a business deal or a performance. It was a beginning, built from the most unlikely of foundations, and she wouldn't have it any other way. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with tears and a joy so profound it took her breath away. "A million times yes." And in the heart of her warm, thriving bakery, surrounded by the sweet scent of fresh-baked bread, she knew she had found something more valuable than a business. She had found a home, a love, and a forever, all in a bargain she was never meant to refuse. Thank you for watching. If you loved the emotional roller coaster of Harriet and Daniel's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more spellbinding tales of romance. What was your favorite moment in the story? Let me know in the comments below.